Hello, ladies and gents, boys and girls, people of all ages, sexualities, and identities. Welcome back to another film review. And today's film review is none other than Peaky Blinders, The Immortal Man. So, what is The Immortal Man about? Well, it follows on from the Peaky Blinders franchise and essentially gives us context to exactly what's happened since. Thomas Shelby has moved away from Birmingham after the loss of his brother Arthur. However, till later on in the film, we don't really know exactly what happened to Arthur. But him and Ada have a talk because of the fact that his son is going off the rails in Birmingham and has essentially kind of scornished and stained the Peaky Blinders name. His son has turned the pub, the Garrison, into an absolute brothel, treating people in there to drugs and sex and debauchery at every single turn and corner. He's living it up like every teenager should to a certain extent. Except from he's been nicking medicine from the young, has been leaving the hospitals during a very, very bleak time vulnerable to the attacks of the Nazis, and has basically caused Birmingham to become an absolute shithole. However, his father, meanwhile, is kind of dealing with the demons that keep haunting him outside of his house. And Tommy finds himself in a bit of reconciliation, trying to decide whether he should live or whether he should die. And at the end of the story, he begins to realize that maybe dying isn't so much of a bad thing after all. During the course of a lot of these problems, Thomas turns up back in Birmingham to find out that his sister Ada has been shot through the head. The last holding piece of his family is finally gone. That is where the title Immortal Man begins to stain in his writing. Tommy starts to reconcile with this idea that everyone who didn't want to die has died, and everyone who has died has left him as the immortal. He then begins to beat up his son in the slop and basically threaten him after the death of his aunt, asking him why did he let Thomas's brother's sister die. He also knows that his son was in connection with the plot to kill Ada in the first place. This is what angers him the most. After a visit from a gypsy woman who essentially is the Raven of Death, Thomas knows that his son aims to kill him. And at the end of the day, he's not too peeved about it. After all, Thomas does want peace. But along this dark and dangerous path, he finds himself revisiting the ghosts of Grace and Ada alike. The spirits are calling to Thomas Shelby, and most importantly, he finds himself admitting to the gypsy woman that at the end of the day, Thomas actually killed Arthur with his own bare hands. He killed him because he felt that he was the Jekyll to his Hyde, and by silencing him, he thought that it would bring him peace. But over the years, it's left him with nothing more than contempt for the man he has become. As one last good deed to the people of Birmingham, Thomas Shelby comes up with an idea to overdo the Nazis for a dangerous plot that involves them and a bunch of false bits of cash that are being transported through the docks. Thomas goes to a couple of his old pals and asks them to come along to help him secure this final win, but what he doesn't tell them is the fact that he aims to die. Tommy gets locked in a tunnel once again and causes himself to panic. However, he pushes through and climbs up to help his son overdo the man who shot his sister. However, even though the pair of them manage to succeed, Thomas gets shot 3 times, bang, 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 in the stomach. And as a last will and request, he asks his own son in cold blood to shoot him dead like a horse. He explains that this is mercy, and although his son doesn't want to do it, it's the only way that he shall take over the reins of king and become the gypsy king he was always meant to be. After Tommy's death, they take his body onto the top of the hill and burn it, as a gypsy representation of kind of letting them go off to the afterlife. In these flashing moments, we get to see Thomas Shelby looking back at himself from birth to death, watching all the people and seeing all the people that he had loved over the years. After this, his son takes up the mantle and becomes the next Peaky Blinder. Throughout the course of this film, there's a lot of things to digest, and one of the best things I think that they did do in this film is this idea that Thomas separates himself from his son. One of his old pals asks whether he is anything like Thomas, and Thomas says no, he's the better man. So, overall, what did I think of Peaky Blinders, The Immortal Man? I've got to say, I love the scenic kind of scenery that happens in this film. However, there are a lot of nitpicks I've got to get to first. I am a little bit ashamed that we didn't get to see Arthur before his death. I'm also a little bit ashamed that there's a lot of absence between a lot of the people who died and not many references to them except from photographs in this film. Another major dislike for me is I didn't like that it took till the middle of the film for them to play the Peaky Blinders tune. I feel like what always made it so prominent and interesting was that it always played at the beginning of each episode in the TV series. Now, I get that films and TV series are always going to be separate due to the dynamic and the way they're written and the way they're produced. However, I do feel like taking away from that format has I feel like it's downpedaled this. I also kind of feel like the biggest letdown to me is this film doesn't really end with a way that it feels like it's going to continue. It kind of feels like the lead-lined nail in the coffin, and that this is their way of saying that Peaky Blinders is over. Now, in fact, I don't think that this is necessarily the worst thing, because you could definitely go off and make another film, but I do feel like the fact that there was an absence of Alfie Solomon and a bunch of other people who we know are still alive, I feel like really grinds at the grindstone with this, and makes it impossible to kind of move forward without thinking to yourself there were so many other avenues they could have gone down. I mean, it's not that I wouldn't still want them to kill off Thomas Shelby, but I feel like we could have had 3 films to do that, rather than have him die at the end of this film in such a kind of ironic way. I mean, he bites the bullet, yes, but I feel like his son stepping in front of him and getting in the way of the taxi is kind of a bruise to his kind of sacrifice. And the fact that his son is so relenting in this idea that, oh, I would have killed my aunt, but I can't kill my dad, I feel like is a really kind of, I don't know how to put it. It just feels wrong to me. But that all in turn, that is just my opinion on this film. And overall, I did still love that we got to the grindstone of, look, they've killed off all the Peaky Blinders. This is the end of their story. Whether it becomes the beginning of someone else's story or his son's story is yet to be told. But it would be interesting if at least they did make some kind of nod in the future to whether or not this is going to continue. So now that we've got my views and everything out the way of like the actual story, let's get down to the grindstone of what I'm trying to say. What would I give this film out of 10? Well, it's not as great as I hoped, but it's not as bad as I thought either. And for that reason, I'm going to give it a solid 7 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next review. Until then, goodbye, stay beautiful, and have an incredible day, you beautiful people.